immigrant who was a lesbian. The couple had lived in Colorado, but they had gotten married in Iowa, and they went back to Colorado to live, and that was approved. Similarly, there was a visa petition by a man who filed for his foreign partner, and they were living in Florida, but they had been married in Vermont, and the Immigration Service called the lawyer the day after the court case came down and said, hey, your visa petition is going to be approved. So it looked like they were going to be very liberal. So we have to wait for their announcements of how they're going to enforce it. Initially, the State Department didn't say anything. The USCIS announced that we will generally follow the celebration rule, but sometimes we'll look to the law of the domicile of the U.S. citizen or permanent resident, and we may need to provide further guidance going forward. Very equivocating. We didn't really know what they meant. I knew what they meant based on the history of the celebration rule. So I was a little worried. I thought maybe this isn't as great. This isn't just going to open up marriage for all gay people or all same-sex marriages. The State Department came out with a very unequivocal statement. And they said, in immigration, we follow the celebration rule. It doesn't matter whether marriage is legal in the home country of the immigrant. And it doesn't matter what state the couple will reside in. As long as the marriage is valid in the place where it's celebrated, we will give the visa, assuming they meet all the other criteria for a visa. So that sounded really great. And the same day that they made that announcement, the USCIS, which is a part of the Homeland Security Department, and which makes the decisions on the visa petitions, kind of rephrased what they said in terms of whether or not they would recognize all same-sex marriages. They said, generally, we will look to the law of the state where the marriage was celebrated. However, we will apply all relevant laws. They took out the part about looking to the law of the domicile of the U.S. citizen or permanent resident, and they took out the part about saying we may need to provide further guidance. The fact that they prefaced their celebration rule endorsement with generally and followed it with a statement that said we're going to apply all relevant laws just as we do for heterosexual couples is still concerning to me. So I'm not sure that they were as unequivocal as we would like them to be. So couples who live in a state where marriage, same-sex marriage is not recognized, still have potentially an issue. We do have one bright spot. If you file an I-130 visa petition with the Immigration Service, let's say the couple lives in Illinois, they went to Iowa to get married, they came back to Illinois to live, and the Immigration Service denies that visa petition. The Board of Immigration Appeals, on August 13th, announced a decision called Matter of Zeleniak. And in that case, they didn't recite the facts. They didn't tell us whether the people lived in the state where the marriage took place or not, whether the marriage was legal in the state where they were living. They just said, in immigration, we follow the celebration rule. If the marriage is valid in the place where it's celebrated, the only other issue we have to look at is whether or not the marriage is genuine for all the reasons people normally get married and not a phony marriage just to get a green card. So, if you file a visa petition and it gets denied because they say, hey, you live in a state that doesn't recognize same-sex marriage, we know you got married in a state that recognizes it, but because Illinois won't recognize it, we're gonna deny your petition. Guess where you file that appeal? With the Board of Immigration Appeals, the same agency that made that Zeleniak decision. If I were filing a case for a couple that lived in Illinois, that got married in one of the states that allows same-sex marriage, or a foreign country that allows it, I would submit a copy of that Matter of Zeleniak case with my I-130 visa petition.
And I want you to keep that under your hat because we probably will come back to that on the Q&A section. One question that I have for all the attorneys here and in the audience, and we will revisit in the Q&A section, is are there any particular approaches you as an attorney would like mental health care professionals to take when providing mental health evaluations in support of the hardship waiver? So we'll be talking about hardship waivers, and you as an attorney, what we like to see from the mental health professional. And with that, I leave the baton to Kim.
Thank you. That was a lot of good information. I've been taking notes here. So, and I'm coming over here because I feel so isolated over there. So we've heard a lot about the processes and the laws and the policies. So let's hear now about the human side of this, if you will, who's coming through the door for this counseling and information and making it through the processes. So we ended with this question about hardship assessments and what attorneys would like from mental health professionals to provide, or what information is needed. And so we're going to move to the two other people on the panel, and that's Angela Fadragas and Dr. Elena Quintana, and we're going to talk a little bit about more of the mental health aspects of this. So in terms of processing hardship assessments, let's step back actually and talk about just the role that stigma plays in folks' willingness or unwillingness to identify as LGBT. And either of you can answer that, or both.
I'd like just briefly to explain to people hardship assessments and what they are and stuff. Hardship is, there's several things that we do, or at least that I do in practice in working with attorneys. There's hardship assessments for the I-601 waiver, which is usually the one that's having to do with marriage and having, I'm sorry, and having to go through the and having to go through the consular process. There's also hardship assessment for the cancellation of removal that you need to determine if, thank you very much, a hardship exists in the family, and that's to prove your case and to support the evidence, the legal evidence that's being presented. On the other hand, there's mental health assessments that are done for VAWA and for U visas, people experiencing a crime in the United States while here. And the VAWA is violence against women, although other categories, I believe, fall within that, because I've done hardship assessments for individual that's not just necessarily spouse related. So that's sort of in a nutshell what a hardship assessment is.
I'll talk a little bit about stigma in general. I think that one of the phrases that you hear a lot in immigration, in people who are really fighting for more rights in terms of immigration, is that no human being is illegal. And I think that there's a long history of human beings being illegal, right? And I think that this is where there's kind of a nexus between what's happening with LGBT individuals around the globe and combined or compounded with immigration issues. And so you think about, you know, Jews and many other populations during the Holocaust, or slaves in the U.S., right, during slavery, or Black South Africans during apartheid, and you know, Palestinians, LGBT people now in various locations and situations, Japanese Americans in the U.S. during World War II. I mean, there's many, many, many examples of how people are criminalized. And when you compound discriminatory practice on top of discriminatory practice, it creates a very difficult way, just psychologically, of moving through the world. And if you think about, for each of us, there's generally about 6 people that will be intimately affected by what we do. And so if you think about all of that stigma, and many, you know, times at least 6 or 7, the weight of the population that holds that stigma in terms of the way that we legally oppress people, it's quite a huge footprint. And that's why it's so important to try. I know that we're talking about all of these legal specificities, but they create these enormous and complex psychological realities in people's lives and in their families.
So let's stay on that theme and talk about the psychological impact of, this is a huge process. It's an unwieldy process, and kudos to folks who actually go through this process because it's crazy. So how is, and we've heard about undocumented folks being here as well, so I want to talk about both aspects of immigration in terms of being here legally and being undocumented, and think more about the dynamic on the family that this immigration processing has.
Well, oftentimes a family can have multiple statuses of documentation. You can have undocumented individuals, you can have U.S. borns, you can have U.S. residents or citizens, all within the same family grouping. One of the things that every family has sort of a developmental history. The spouse or the couple meet and then their children are developed or not, but that there's this sort of historical developmental process that all families go through. What happens with the immigration process is that it disrupts that natural development that happens either in a couple or a family with children, in the sense that there's involuntary separations. There is the fear of deportation for a family member. There's the consular process. With the new waiver process that started this year, it's a lot shorter process, but it used to be anywhere from 9 months to 2 years of separation in a foreign country, while relatives were still either here or in a foreign country, and children were separated from siblings, from parents, and it created the same dynamics that families who are going through divorce would create, or a family going through incarceration. So it created all these developmental issues within a family that typically would not have been there had the immigration issue not been present. Because oftentimes these are intact families that wish to stay intact, but because of the involuntary separation, look like divorced families or separated families and go through those types of family dynamics that are involuntary in the process, but the emotional hardship is the same. I've worked with children whose a parent has been incarcerated. They get picked up for a traffic violation, and then all of a sudden they're gone for 2 weeks. And that separation, which had not happened previously in the family, leaves a residue in the family in the sense that those children then regress in their developmental process and become clingier and become more dependent on that parent, so that any future separation is seen by parents going to disappear again. So this is a process that would not have been present in this family if the immigration issue were not there.
Did you want to answer?
I think that there's just living life. There's so many things, if you think about like just everyday challenges that people have, is that there's so many people going through immigration proceedings that fear for their lives in their home countries. And I just want to underscore how this is many times more the case for LGBT individuals, to an extent that people here don't really understand it, and that it's very difficult for them to be adequately assessed for asylum. I've traveled pretty extensively, particularly in the Middle East, doing consultations around violence prevention, and every single time I go almost, and I'm like overwhelmed with the number of questions of what do we do to dissuade children from being gay. I have to say that I've been asked that question like, I don't know, scores of times. And it's heartbreaking because because what will happen to them is basically they will be killed. They will hide themselves forever, or they will be killed. And I think it's easy for people here to minimize the how grave the situation is. But it's grave here too. I mean, because if you look at the suicide rates, I mean, when you put this kind of marginalization and you systemically marginalize people, they kill themselves more. Like for immigrants here, the suicide rate is 2.5 times that of the general population. For gay teens, they attempt suicide 3 times more. And according to the Trevor Project, and I really almost can't believe this, but I looked it up, that up to 30% of completed suicides are LGBT individuals. That's a crisis here, right? And I think that it has everything to do with all of these legal particulars that we're talking about in kind of a sterile way, that it wreaks such havoc and psychological damage and wind in the face of all of these people that are just trying to make a life and love people and be part of families.
I'm tying in with that in terms of LGBT issues and talking about family dynamics. Oftentimes, there isn't the social or legal validation that this is even a family, and that's based on Esther's testimony. In terms of working together with the family dynamic. And that lack of recognition can create a lot of psychological or psychopathology that typically would not be there under other circumstances.
Can you say more about that?
Well, oftentimes in both LGBT families and others, you will see through this immigration process higher levels of depression and anxiety than you would otherwise, and in some cases PTSD, depending on either the immigration process or the incarceration process that the family has gone through, that there is some residue of PTSD symptoms, not in just one member, but in multiple members of the family. Oftentimes I've found the spouse that is the non-national spouse tends to have less symptomatology present than the national or the U.S. resident spouse, in the sense that there is, not that they need, it's a matter of degree, but oftentimes the spouse that is the U.S. resident has the experience that the loss will be greater for them on multiple levels, while the non-national, and oftentimes, is trying to keep the family together as much as possible, as well as negotiate and navigate their own guilt in the process of the family dynamic.
I think the other thing I want to say is that it's true, there's this added burden and with family and everything, and I think that we do have things to be excited about in terms of how this piece of DOMA was struck down and how we are looking on the horizon toward marriage equality, and people get very excited about that, but there's such a long way to go before we get to real blanket equality in terms of marriage, in terms of employment, adoption, freedom of gender expression, pay. I mean, there's, not to mention all of immigration, because there is so much discretion in terms of who will be considered and who won't be considered. And so when you think about mental health, I always think of it as when we marginalize people, I always think of it about how you're greeted into the world. Like, for some people, it's like, hi, I'm so glad you're here, what can I do for you, right? And then when you think about marginalized populations, it's more like, what are you doing here? Or I'm going to have to ask you to leave, right? Those are two very different ways of greeting people. And in some really horrible cases, it's like, I hope you die, right? So we need to, we're celebrating because we're moving from, what are you doing here? I'm going to have to ask you to leave, to maybe like, hi. You know what I mean? Where it's not great. It's not great. So I don't want to really lose track of how that is. I mean, we need to get to, I'm so happy you're here. What can I do for you, right? That's where we need to be, you're a beautiful person. What can I do for you? I'm so happy you're here. that's when people are well. That's when people can achieve wellness, right? And I just want to, I mean, I'm putting it in those terms so that we can kind of look at the very biggest picture, right? And that we're just really happy because, you know, people aren't willing us to die. I mean, like, let's get parity and let's, you know, really improve things.
Oh, that's beautiful. I'm really struck by that. So what kinds of questions or awareness do you think social workers and clinicians need to have to really determine from people what they need in this crazy process of immigration? What should folks be looking for who may not be as sensitive to LGBT issues as others, as the people on the panel are? So we live in a bubble. What kinds of questions should social workers and clinicians be asking of folks who come to them who are immigrants, who may identify as LGBT or may not be quite ready to say they identify as LGBT, but to make sure that they are getting the full legal help that they want?
I think a piece of it is really just asking about what is the climate in your country and what happens, who's not accepted in your country, and what is your relationship to those people, because they may be incredibly ashamed or fearful no matter what to say, this is who I am, or this is how I identify, or this is why it's unsafe for me to go back, or whatever. But it's important to fully understand what is that person's perception of the landscape in their country for marginalized populations, and what is their relationship to that population.
I think there's just general stereotyping about immigrant families all in general, and one of the things is it's not recognizing it as a family, or not recognizing that there are attachments and family ties. So that you have much more generalization of why don't they go back to their home country, or you know, why even go through this process, and not look at the psychological impact that the immigration process, the lack of recognition as an intact family, and the impact that it would have on multiple members of the family in general.
Maybe now? Okay. So this is for all the panelists. And I know the LGBT community faces particular challenges in trying to prove that they're married. Any one of you who want to take a stab at it, you know, it could be because they live in a small community and they're not out. Maybe they're not out to their families. Maybe they don't hold bank accounts together. I mean, the requirements when someone is going to petition an adjustment of status on a partner or a spouse, in theory, should be the same, but in reality, it's not because of societal constraints. Any one of you want to talk about this in particular? Bum, bum, bum.
Well, I can take a, I mean, just, you know, the central question in many of the cases that that we deal with in immigration is hardship. You know, there's different levels of it. When you're before a judge, it's exceptional and extremely unusual hardship, a very high standard. When you're doing consular processing, as we mentioned earlier, you're talking about extreme hardship. When you're filing a petition under the Violence Against Women's Act, you're talking about extreme cruelty. When you're talking about a U visa, you're talking about substantial physical or mental abuse. So it all centers around hardship in one degree or another. And I think the assessments, tying back to one of the questions earlier, I think a lot of it is very similar to all the other assessments, but it's a matter of degree in a sense. Because I think when you're talking about LGBT communities, if you're talking about a different type of exclusion, a different pain, maybe it's a more severe because you're being excluded not from just an immigration context, but you're also being excluded because of who you love. The degree of isolation is probably more severe. So in immigration, I mean, a person who's undocumented may feel isolated because they have less options to express themselves formally in the formal economy, for example. But you add to that the isolation a person feels based upon their family and who they love. So I think a lot of the assessment, a lot of the factors, the emotional factors, the psychological factors, the economic factors, the cultural factors, all these things can still be assessed in the same way, but I think here we're adding an element of degree, and it's a little more, not a little more severe, in many cases it's going to be a lot more severe. And so I just wanted to touch on that with the hardship, because I think that's where we're going, that these assessments are in line and keeping with the other previous assessments that we've had before, but I think here we can adjust them with a matter of degree in many cases.
I also would say in my practice, I've come across a lot of people who I discover they need to get a hardship assessment or a mental health assessment, and I'm trying to evaluate what are their chances of prevailing. What's the chance that they're going to actually get that? And I have to talk to them, and I'm like trying to find out about their family, about their well-being, is everything okay? It is a natural human reaction to say, yeah, I'm fine, everything's great. No, my kids are fine. No, I'm well-adjusted, homosexual. But the truth is, you have to dig it out of people. And it's a process. To get out of them, to get them to admit what really is affecting them, how is this a problem for them? And I call it pulling teeth. It's like going to a dentist and having your teeth pulled one at a time. It's a painful process for the person who has to go through it. But frequently, when it's all said and done, if you do it the right way, and you get a good mental health assessment out of it, the person benefits greatly. It's cathartic for them, but it also helps them win their immigration case.
And all of this is very important, but to take it back to the family petition stage, even just proving that your marriage is bona fide is more difficult for LGBT couples than it is for opposite sex couples, right? So you have to file documentary evidence that you entered into your marriage in good faith to establish a life together and not to simply evade immigration laws, sham marriage just to get a green card, right? So couples, in order to prove their bona fide marriage, submit joint tax returns, documentation that they're beneficiaries on each other's health plans, car insurance, etc. This can prove to be more difficult for same-sex couples because they may not choose to add their spouse on their health insurance plan or any other type of retirement plan, etc., because they fear discrimination, right? Especially if they live in a state that's not the friendliest to LGBT individuals. So, with the repeal of Section 3 of DOMA, couples can now file federal taxes jointly, but they may still not be able to file state taxes jointly, get married and file jointly. So those are other obstacles, not only just at the very beginning stage, let alone if they're going to need some sort of hardship assessment for a waiver, or etc. One other obstacle that I see LGBT couples face is potentially the allegation of fraud, of marriage fraud in the past, because let's say that they were married to an opposite sex partner, right? And so if a visa petition was filed in a heterosexual context, that's going to raise eyebrows for USCIS. Whether it's merited or not, it's going to raise eyebrows. But there's a whole host of reasons why somebody could have been married in the past, an individual may be bisexual.
Can I just add to that for 1 second? If someone is found out to have previously had a fraudulent marriage, then in the future going forward they are not eligible for any other visa petition, even if that subsequent marriage is genuine and bona fide. So this is a big one for LGBT people. If they were previously married and they later in life come out of the closet, this is going to be possibly a problem if there was a prior application.
Right, absolutely right, Saul.
So it could be something, many scenarios. It could be someone who was bisexual and they were first married to somebody of the opposite sex, and then they saw the light or they changed preference, being bisexual, and then they marry a partner of the same sex.
And to be clear, there's a difference between the finding of marriage fraud and perhaps the finding of not being able to prove the bona fides of your marriage. Okay, those are two different things. If the person is bisexual and was married to an opposite sex partner in the past, or if they weren't out yet, you know, in their life, those things don't equate to marriage fraud, right? And I think they shouldn't, right, in our eyes, right? But that's where I think that mental health professionals are also very important to provide a context to that person's life and maybe why they didn't come out as what they did, or etc.
I just, to follow up on what Solomon said, oftentimes there's a stigma towards the experience of mental health issues. As I mentioned earlier, many of these families have high levels of anxiety and depression or PTSD or some other thing that's going on. And it takes several sessions for them to feel levels of comfort to then be able to speak in a much more frank manner about some of the mental health struggles that they're going through. Or sometimes they're not able to verbalize it in a clear way, and sort of in speaking and doing your research with them, then they start revealing their struggles that they're experiencing.